Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a video on how weed affects your neurons. So if you already have a good idea of how neurons function, then keep watching. If you don't, go ahead and go back and watch my video on how neurons work, and that will give you a good baseline to understand what's going on here. So before we get into how weed specifically affects your neurons, we need to know how the neurotransmitters GABA and glutamate affect neurons. So GABA, shown in blue here, affects your neurons. Once it's released by the axon of one neuron and binds to a new neuron, it causes the new neuron to open chloride channels. And these chloride channels allow chloride to flow into the cell, and the cell becomes more negatively charged or more hyperpolarized, and the signal stops there. So no electrical signal is passed on to a new neuron. Now, in real-world application, if you have a lot of GABA flowing through the neurons in your brain, this would make you feel calm and relaxed because your brain isn't racing because there aren't a lot of electrical signals going through it. Your neurons aren't working hard. In contrast, glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Therefore, as you see in purple here, when glutamate is released and binds to a new neuron, this causes sodium channels, potassium channels, and calcium channels to open. Now, a little bit of potassium flows out, but primarily a lot of sodium and a lot of calcium flows into the neuron. And ultimately, this causes a new action potential because this neuron becomes more positively charged, more depolarized, and a new action potential is created and the signal is passed along to a new neuron. Now, in real-world application, glutamate, if you have a lot of glutamate flowing through your neurons, flowing through your brain, then you're going to have kind of racing thoughts, or maybe you're thinking really quickly, or maybe going to be a little bit anxious. And keep in mind while I'm saying all of this, this is a very, very basic explanation of what's going on, but generally that's what happens. Now, moving on to how weed affects your brain. So the main components of weed are called cannabinoids, and the main cannabinoid is THC, also known as tetrahydrocannabidiol. And this compound is very unique because actually what happens when you have tetrahydrocannabidiol in your body from smoking a lot of weed, instead of neurotransmitter being released from the axon and passed to the dendrite of one neuron, what happens is a GABA or a glutamate neuron releases GABA or glutamate to this neuron, and the tetrahydrocannabidiol that is present in this neuron actually goes back from the postsynaptic cell to the presynaptic cell, and it binds to this previous neuron, and it causes potassium channels to open and potassium to flow out of the cell, thus making the cell more negatively charged or inhibitory, and it also decreases the calcium in the cell and doesn't allow them to help release neurotransmitters out to cause further interactions. So overall, THC is released backwards and causes the cell to become more negatively charged. And ultimately, in real-world application, it's important to know whether or not it's affecting a GABA or a glutamate cell. So if it's inhibiting a GABA cell, that means you're going to be more anxious, you're going to have more racing thoughts because you're getting rid of GABA, which is a relaxing neurotransmitter. There's less GABA released. Whereas if THC is binding to a neuron that was releasing glutamate, then you're going to become calmer because you're going to be eliminating glutamate traveling through your neurons, and you're going to be more relaxed. So that kind of explains how cannabinoids and the way that weed affects your neurons are very, very unique. And depending on the person, this can affect more GABA-based neurons or more glutamate-based neurons. So a lot of times that is why some people get very paranoid while smoking weed, and some people believe that it allows them to become more relaxed. Furthermore, this doesn't vary just between person to person. This also varies based on the blend of cannabinoids within the weed. So some weed has more cannabidiol, some weed has more THC. Now, this is just a theory of mine that we're delving a little bit more into, not necessarily scientific evidence, but I believe what they'll uncover over time is that, THC generally will decrease GABA neurons from releasing more GABA, and whereas cannabidiol probably inhibits glutamate neurons and makes you more calm. So I hope we've learned something today, and you have a good rest of your evening.